Hey everybody, this is Kubernetes SIG Architecture Production Readiness Subproject meeting for November 1st. And let me share. Did I share am I sharing the screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Let's go. So retrospective on 129. Any comments here?
For my part, I found our coordination with the shadows a little less effective this time. I felt like I waited too long to see if the shadows would pick up and do a first pass on some things. And I think that's a combination of the soft freeze. So the PRR shadows are like, well, are they all here for me to make a choice against? So that happening, and then trying to be sure that there was time to go through, and that effectively means usually, well, potentially 3 rounds, one from a shadow, one with a question from an approver, and then the responses. So I felt like that timeline was a little smushed, and I actually would be interested in whether I stepped on shadows while I was doing it, because at a certain point, like the Tuesday of the freeze or something, that afternoon I just started going through everything, whether there was a shadow on it or not. I went through the list. I realized that puts the shadows in a tough spot, so I just wonder like how that worked. Otherwise, didn't seem that bad to me. Something to try to work out for 130. I really want to work out the client feature sets, client Go, since that came out of the SIG Arch call almost 2 months ago now, a month and a half. I think we have a viable design for making that work, and like to get enough of it finished so that we can actually start requiring it for client features that come in, because I don't want to stop client features forever, but I do think we have a justifiable reason to say risky things in client Go just can't land. Han.
Yeah, so I mean, I find the shadowing interesting and also inconsistent from release to release, because I really like that one shadowing release where we actually had the dedicated pairing sessions, but we haven't done that since. And we have new shadows too. So it's not like if we do something like that, we should probably do it every time, right?
I had not thought about that. That's a very good point, and I could see that being useful. There was the release where we did the pairing sessions. That was the first one. And then there was the release where we were trying to get shadows to go first, which, now that you mention it, I agree, only makes sense for those who have done it before.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, you're right. We should do that again.
I mean, even if you haven't done it before, I still like the pairing sessions. They're just kind of nice to go through the protocol, right? Like, it's 4 months since the last time, and how often do you do PR reviews? It's very bursty.
Yeah. I like that idea.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I turned off my video because I'm getting a lot of poor quality connectivity. I think that makes sense. Yeah, for me, it was really crammed this cycle to the very end, and that's my own scheduling issues as opposed to anything else. So that makes the pairing sessions harder. But what do we, David? You brought up the soft freeze. Is the soft freeze useful? Like, I don't find that anybody really. I mean, I do get people thinking it's a freeze, and so they come to me like the day before the soft freeze. So I guess in some sense it's useful. But I don't get that many of them. Like what? It almost sounded like from what you were saying, David, that you thought it was more of a problem than an advantage.
Yeah, I'm not looking at it as a problem. I am looking at it as like, at what point can I reasonably expect that shadows have put their name on the things that they want to look at, right? And we had The first release, we had just sort of assigned people, right? It was, you're attached to John, you're attached to David, you're attached to Wojtek, and let's divvy these up. And we did that in later releases. There was an attempt to let people figure out, or at least for my part, and I think we've discussed it as well, figure out what it is they needed to complete the suite. I said people minus Han's just like, this is cool, let's do this. I like looking at a bunch of enhancements. But a chance for everyone else to say, like, where are my gaps for becoming an approver, to self-select. And so that means I was trying to wait for them to find it and then go through and review after they had gone through once. Yeah. So I don't think it was a problem. It was just me thinking about, when are they actually going to be able to have been done?
So maybe, but maybe some more active management of the shadowing process is kind of what I'm hearing that we need.
Yeah, and I think what Hans suggested, he pointed out, like, it's been a while since we've done this. A bunch of people have come in since then. Yeah, let's go ahead and do the more hands-on approach again, and maybe try to nudge the people who've done it for a while. I guess that would be Han and Joe and Jeremy. And, there's a couple others, to actually, like, do you have gaps left? What would you like to do? We'd be happy to have you look. Like, it's still useful if you don't want the approver rights, but make an active choice.
I actually think PRR, like, this is possibly contentious, but I actually don't think that PRR should be as hard as it is. Like, that's kind of a reference to the thing that I linked here with the Tim Hawken document. But basically, like, we should have a guide. And when people don't do stuff on caps, we should point to a line number and ask them to do that. And if it's not in the guide and we're asking a question, we should ask the question and then amend it to the guide, commit it, and then point to the guide.
I mean, that's kind of what the questionnaire is, right? It's the guide, right? We're asking people, this is what we're asking people to do. I'm not sure how it's different. We have to evaluate the quality of their answers. That's really what we're doing. And then we also tend to look at potential design issues, but that's actually kind of just because we happen to be looking at it. At least in my case, like, when it gets down to time pressure, I assume that the SIG leads and others are doing that design analysis, and I'm looking just at the questionnaire when, like, I've got 20 more to do in a day or two. But in general, I try to take the time to fully understand the cap and provide other feedback as well. But I don't know if that's something we want to make part of the official process.
I mean, I also read the full cap because that's kind of one of my motivations for doing this, is just to read a bunch of caps, you know.
Yeah, well, you have to understand the cap in order to evaluate whether the answers are correct or
sure, but there are, like, API patterns, right? Like these are, like, acceptable patterns of, you know, like, doing X or considering rollback scenarios or whatever, right? Like,
yeah, I think that would be great if we can document better what those patterns are and point people to them. I think that would be, I'm all for less work for sure, and for better quality planning coming out before it even gets to us. So yeah, that sounds like a reasonable.
No, I will admit, I do see some areas where it is less clear. One that came up notably in this past release was, is it necessary for the feedback to an API or feature consumer to happen at the level of interaction that they have? And so the example that I'm thinking of is, there was a kubelet feature that was exercised and used at the level of the API, but only had visibility with fairly high node level permissions. And it's not clear whether we allow or disallow that interaction. And that might be a spot where SIG Arch needs to come in and provide stronger guidance around expectations, because I think, yeah, there are different opinions, but if someone
I'm not
is
saying we would just write the guide once and then just point to it forever. I think we would discover certain things are not in the guide, like we don't have an answer for this, and SIG Arch does need to provide guidance for this. And once they do, put it in the guide, point to the portion, and be like, your permissions are too overly permissive, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Like, we will continue to discover areas. Like, I think over the last couple of years, we've discovered a few of these patterns and expectations around how we would want things to work. Um, like for client tools, previously they just would add a flag and put in the documentation, this is an alpha flag, and I've been requiring people to have an environment variable basically that has to give this positive acknowledgement by the user that they know they're using an alpha field, an alpha flag. And so that's a pattern that we devised through this process. There'll be other patterns, and David, this pattern which you raised a month or two ago, I think is really critical, important one. We probably need to come to some agreement at the broader community, sort of architecture level of what's the right approach. And I tend to lean towards where you are, David, of like, if you can do it with the API, you should be able to see whether it worked with the API.
Han, do you happen to know which ones you think we're missing, and we can try to split up and
I mean,
address those?
do we even have like, I mean, we have the questionnaire, but the questionnaire just asks the questions. It doesn't say what the acceptable realm of correct answers would look like.
So I think there's some of them have in the comments, they point people towards examples, but not all of them. We do have like you're thinking of sort of like we have the API conventions document. We
Yes.
would have a
Exactly.
readiness conventions document. Here's how and some of those are closely related. Like, we do have a pattern for how we do. We have a whole bunch of code implemented around feature gates, right? Like,
Exactly.
we have a way of an acceptable way to do it. And rarely do we get people trying to do something different, but occasionally, but rarely. So, but yeah, I mean, I think that in the spirit of open source, great idea, Han. You just signed yourself up for writing the initial.
All right, fine.
Or,
All right, fine.
Or at least identifying the ones where there are gaps. There may be some. I know there are many, though, where we say feature gate, here's a checkbox, or alert, here's a checkbox. So
I think we should have an actual like doc that we can point to, like, instead of just being embedded in comments in the questionnaire, because there's like a zillion questions and no one's going to read the entire thing. And
well, counterpoint, the person who's filling it out has to read the entire thing or they can't fill it out.
okay, I mean, but do you really want to shove the guide into the questionnaire?
I'm flexible, Han. Like, if you want to duplicate another spot, I will say in some ways the guide exists the way it does because of the workflows that myself, John, and Wojtek had. And my workflow, for instance, is heavily based around copy a template, go through, answer the questions in line, and the chances of me clicking and then reading and looking up in another spot, they're not zero, but they're pretty low. And so having it in line was a way to optimize for my workflow. And if that's not the best way, then we can consider, like, what are other options? We're not married to it, but there are many workflows where that works well.
Let me think about it.
So yeah, well, I mean, I think why don't you give it some thought, Han? Why don't you take the action item to um, make a cut at to figure out what to propose something here.
Sure.
Propose something here. I think that that makes a lot of sense, and it may be that it's like some things are already, feature gates. You can just refer to the existing documentation on feature gates, right? Like maybe that's links from the questionnaire into some guide or multiple guides. All right. Anything else we wanted to talk about on the retrospective?
Nothing more from me.
Okay. All right, then I guess nobody's here other than Han. Do we have anybody who is interested in meeting the bar for approver, or something we talked about prior to the cycle was that if we don't have anybody who meets the bar or is interested in meeting the bar or wants to be an approver, that we may have to come up with a different way to share the load than we've been doing. So
I don't
without
want
the
to become an approver until there are enough other approvers so that the load is actually somewhat manageable. It just seems terrible what you guys have to go through cycle after
I love
cycle.
it. Okay. So what I heard Han say, if I were doing it, I would say we need one other person. Because if you had 5, that's actually not too bad. That's less than.
Possibly, yeah. Possibly, yeah.
All right, we just have to find 2.
Yeah. So that okay. So let's raise that maybe with the shadows and Slack, see if anybody and we can we can talk about that. Otherwise, I think we have to potentially fall into we broaden it to like 8 or 10 people, but we require 2 reviews, like all the shadow, but that might not end up being less work. So I don't know, right? I think that was one potential option, right? Require 2 approvals instead of 1, and then each approver doesn't need to meet the bar that we've established, because you assume that 2 people together will meet it, which is just an assumption, right? But it's but anyway, let's not go there yet. Let's see if we can. I heard Han say that he thinks he can go there, but it's too much work right now.
I mean, you guys are putting in a heroic effort release after release. That's what I see. And it seems
work, but it is only for a short period of time, right? I've done no code. David's probably doing a lot more. Like I've done no code reviews right now for code freeze because I just don't. I'm not closely involved in any implementation right now. So, yeah. So I have a couple of days or a week where it's like pretty intense, but it doesn't.
It can be intense,
Yeah.
but I guess on the scale of pain, it is the risks are lower than something like an API review, which makes it less stressful overall.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, if you do get a piece of code out there that you can't turn off and breaks a bunch of clusters, the stress of that's even worse.
True.
Okay. I don't think we have enough quorum to talk much more about that. Did you want to go into this thinking about alpha beta thing, or is that more what we already talked about, Han?
that's more along the lines of what we talked about. Like if you look into the thing, into that doc, like Tim mentions like classes of like patterns right? Which, I mean, we're kind of doing here, right? Like classifying certain acceptable patterns.
Is
Okay.
this closely related to Tim's previous ideas around we only really have two levels? We have alpha, and then we have GA with less
I think
complex.
this is a similar doc. Yeah, this is a similar extension of that idea. Yeah.
So, like, you know, don't necessarily link Tim to me in this recording saying it, but I'm coming around to that perspective. That in practice we have,
Alpha unstable.
yep, and I resisted it for a long time, in part because I thought it was my Red Hat coming out really strong. Red Hat has a very similar set of stuff. There's a few things that have absolutely no support. Then we have a category that gets support, but the support can end with, we're really sorry, but this just isn't going to work. And then we have fully supported essentially forever. And I didn't want to force Cube down to that path just to match what OpenShift was doing. But I am, in practice, I think that's what we're narrowing in on.
Like right there, right? There's like a code snippet of like what is acceptable, right? Like stuff like this. This is kind of what I'm talking about.
Right. Right.
And like we don't have this documented. You don't want to throw this into a comment into the cap. I don't think. This is like, and then you're
Yeah,
going to
no.
have multiple of these, right? So
Yeah.
I'm thinking more like an API convention stock or something.
I mean, what I'm saying is I think that's great. I think we could do that. I think that a number of them might actually just refer to the existing API convention stock, right? Or to other existing documentation, like, but still, nonetheless, there's probably gaps, and we may need a separate document to describe those gaps and fill them in. So that would be awesome.
Okay.
Okay. And Magic's not here, so I guess he's got to. We'll follow up with that one later. So, anything else anybody wants to discuss?
Good.
Okay, cool. Then I think that the conclusions, the two things, I guess, we want. Actually, let's do it here. And then probably one other AI, which is on this one. I guess that's for me. Follow up. Well, I guess it's me and you both, David, and all of us really. But follow up on finding on whether shadows other than on are ready to become approvers. Ready and willing. All right. Okay, then hopefully I'll follow up on Slack with some folks, and then hopefully we'll have people here next time in 2 weeks after KubeCon. Are you guys, Han, you're going, I think, right?
I am. Yeah.
Yeah. And David, will you be there?
Yeah, I'll be there too.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'll see you guys next week then.
All right, sounds good.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.